The 21st African Growth and Opportunity Act Forum is set to take place in Washington, D.C. from today. The Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition, Dawie, is leading the South African delegation, which consists of the private sector, civil society, as well as organized labor representatives. The theme of this year's AGOA Forum is Beyond 2025, Reimagining AGOA for an Inclusive, Sustainable and Prosperous Tomorrow. Just recently, the House of Representatives passed the legislation that would require a review of the U.S. and the U.S. bilateral relations. So what can we expect from this year's forum? Let's now speak to Dawie Roodt, who is an economist. He's with the Efficient Group. He's the chief economist there. Dawie, very good morning to you. Thank you so much for making time for us. I want to start off here. Do you think that Minister Dawie goes to this forum more emboldened, more confident, considering also the proposal that has come from the U.S. that the AGOA be extended for at least 16 years?
Good morning to you. Well, I don't think it will necessarily be extended for another 16 years, but I'm quite positive that South Africa will remain on this AGOA platform and that South Africa will continue to get the benefits from AGOA, especially in the current political junction where we are. I don't think the Americans will make significant changes just before the presidential election in the United States. And if there are any changes, they expect something happening only after next year. But for now, I think the status quo will remain.
The status quo would remain. What are the biggest hurdles that you think South Africa faces as this forum starts?
Well, the biggest hurdles, I would say, is more political than anything else. Remember, one of the requirements of the Americans is that you have to protect American interests. So remember, this is a one-sided agreement. So the Americans said, listen, certain African countries can export to the United States without any import levies, as an example, making it easier for countries in Africa to export to the United States. South Africa is a huge beneficiary from this AGOA agreement. But one of the requirements, or some of the requirements, are that American interests need to be protected, and some other soft issues, like, for example, the free market system needs to be maintained, the protection of private property rights, the rule of law and order, and that. So those are the kind of things that I think are more important. So if I was Minister Dawie, what I would do is to say that South Africa is indeed making sure that interests of all countries in the world are protected in South Africa and the rest of Africa, and that we are indeed a country that abides by law and order and protection of private property rights and the like. So the soft issues, I would say, are far more important.
The soft issues are far more important. Do you think that there could still be a push? Of course, on one end, South Africa just came out of an election and the ANC was totally bruised out of that election. Now you have the Democratic Alliance, which is also part of the Government of National Unity. And the reason that I specifically focus on the Democratic Alliance is that Andrew Whitfield is the Deputy Minister of the Department of Trade and Industry and Competition. He's also part of the delegation. And we know what the Democratic Alliance's stance is on how South Africa has responded to geopolitics, and also where they speak about enemies, quote, enemies of the United States. Do you think having him there would soften the blow?
Well, having him there certainly will soften the blow, but the recent outcome of South Africa's election certainly will improve South Africa's chances of remaining on AGOA. We do know that the ANC on itself is not always on the side of America when it comes to international affairs, while the DA has got a slightly different approach to international affairs. And the fact that we have a coalition government in South Africa now certainly will get the Americans to look differently to South Africa. So that is one of those soft issues that certainly will be to the benefit of South Africa, yes.
Yeah. So with AGOA as well, of course there was that bipartisan push. It happened twice at least. Last year there was a push to have the summit not take place in South Africa. Washington or Biden decided that no, it will go ahead. In February as well, there was another push to review South Africa's inclusion in AGOA. Considering what's happening politically in the United States as well and how things are unfolding, do you think that that could have an impact in the inclusion of South Africa, or perhaps even the proposals that South Africa could make, and whether or not they fall on a fertile soil?
Yeah, there are some major changes happening in the United States. They've got an election at the end of this year, and I think really that will be crucial for South Africa's membership of AGOA. We know that President Biden is very much in favor of South Africa remaining on the AGOA agreement. But I'm afraid if Donald Trump, and it seems as if he could be the next president in the United States, I'm afraid if he is the next president in the United States, I'm not so sure that South Africa's position will be secured on AGOA. For now, I don't believe the Americans will really make any changes as far as AGOA is concerned, simply because of the coming presidential election in the United States and the possibility of a new administration, which can potentially alter this agreement between America and some African countries. So I think it's a wait-and-see kind of approach that the Americans will follow for now.
Yeah. When we look at the bilateral trade with the America as well as the various countries that are part of AGOA on the continent, South Africa is somewhat still in the lead. But Nigeria right at the heels of South Africa. I wonder what this means going forward, and perhaps if you could see a shift where South Africa loses that number one position, or is South Africa still seen as a crucial partner for AGOA?
Certainly, South Africa is the biggest beneficiary of the AGOA agreement. Remember, South Africa is by far the most industrial country on the African continent. And we manufacture a lot of stuff that we export to the United States. And if you compare South Africa to many of the smaller countries or beneficiaries of AGOA, South Africa is significantly larger. I think South Africa will maintain that top position for now. And in fact, I think depending on the agreements and depending on our business people, essentially, it's possible that South Africa actually can expand on that and that we can actually get more benefits based on a AGOA agreement. But again, that will depend on political positioning. How South Africa position ourselves politically. And like I've said earlier, I think South Africa's position politically has certainly improved recently. No, I think South Africa, due to the nature of our economy, being highly industrialized, will assure that South Africa is likely to maintain that top position on AGOA.
Yeah. Are there any threats that South Africa should be looking at?
Not in the short term, but in the slightly medium term, I am a little bit concerned about the possibility of a Trump administration. We do know that Trump will look at international trade completely differently. He's mentioned a number of times that he would like to impose all sort of import duties on certain countries, especially if you're from China. They're mentioning huge import duties on countries like, for example, China. But the point I want to make is that the approach to international trade by Trump and a Biden administration is likely to be completely different. And that certainly is a threat. But for now, I think South Africa's position is quite secure.
And that's the thing, right, is that the Trump administration was accused of protectionism. And while you still have this battle between the US as well as China, and as it stands currently, China is South Africa's biggest trading partner.
Yes, and South Africa is politically also quite close to China. And we know that Trump can be, well, can we say, quite a volatile personality, and maybe one day. Remember, it's not only up to him to decide whether we are part of AGOA, but as a president, he's got a huge say on which countries do benefit from AGOA. So the point I want to make is that Donald Trump, he doesn't like the Chinese that much. South Africa is quite close to the Chinese, and one day Donald Trump may get up in the morning with a sore tooth and decide that he wants to do something about South Africa's membership on AGOA. So a volatile personality in the White House is something that we should be concerned about. But that is something that's next year's problem, not now.
That's something that's whose problem?
That's next year's problem, not now.
That's next year's problem. Yeah, of course, the elections take place in November, and whoever wins the elections only becomes inaugurated as the president of the United States in January.
Can I just make a point about AGOA? I've made some calculations. AGOA is quite important to South Africa, but it's not that important. Even if we are kicked off AGOA, it doesn't mean that South Africa's export to the United States will come to an halt. We will still be able to export to the United States, but it will become more expensive and more difficult for South African companies to compete with other countries exporting to the United States. If, for whatever reason, we are not part of AGOA anymore, it will certainly will shave off a few percentage points, 0.5% in terms of economic growth in South Africa, but we will still have access to the US market, but it will not be the end of the world. But everything adds up. South Africa is on a grey list, so-called grey list. We've got some challenges as far as electricity and infrastructure in South Africa, and all of those things add up. And South Africa's economic growth, as it is at the moment, is less than 1%, and kicking us off AGOA certainly is going to hurt, but it's not going to be the end of the world. Certainly, we should try to remain a member of AGOA, and we should go out of our way, and I hope the Minister Tau is successful in doing that, but it is certainly not the end of the world as far as economic growth is concerned.
Yeah, I see the point that is made here is that the US is, of course, South Africa's second largest trading partner after China, and will form a crucial part of the new government's efforts to revive the economy. South African gross domestic product has expanded by less than 1% year-on-year average over the past decade. And I sometimes wonder, considering that, whether South Africa would have the capacity for new markets that the United States could potentially create for AGOA members?
There are some challenges in South Africa. We know about electricity challenges. That seems to be a little bit better recently. But some new challenges, like, for example, other infrastructural issues like Transnet, our harbors, those are all issues that need to be addressed. But I'm quite optimistic as far as that is concerned. I think that the new management at Transnet, for example, is doing an excellent job. And if we can fix our infrastructure, then I'm pretty sure that the private sector in South Africa will come to the party and make use of all the other benefits that we can gain from AGOA as well. So yes, provided we remain a member of AGOA next year, I'm quite optimistic that we can get even more benefits from exports to the United States.
Yeah, and bringing it back home, of course, the Democratic Alliance have been pushing to ensure that AGOA still remains in place. We know how arrogantly last year, for instance, the minister and the president had spoken about how the United States actually needs us as well. This is now in terms of AGOA. Yes. But what needs to happen in South Africa to ensure that South Africa remains a powerhouse on the continent and also a powerhouse when it comes to the Africa Continental Free Trade Area? And perhaps maybe, I don't know, if the USA is looking into whether or not they can tap into that.
Yeah, I think the African Free Trade Agreement, that's something that has been neglected. We as Africans should put much more effort into trying to get more trade between African countries. And more African countries can actually benefit from AGOA as well. In the short term, the challenges to South Africa are things like, for example, infrastructure. We are addressing that. I know we've got a new government in South Africa, and I'm quite optimistic as far as that is concerned, that we will make certain changes and that we will get our infrastructure fixed in the short term, and we will benefit from AGOA because of a better infrastructure as well. Politically, I think also South Africa is slightly better positioned internationally to benefit and to maintain on the right side of the Americans. So all in all, I'm actually quite positive about the outcome of the South African economy in the short term, but it's going to take a long time before we can get the economy to grow at, say, 4-5%, and that's what we actually need. For now, we are stuck at, say, 1% roughly, and that is just not good enough. Yeah. We need to even do more, and that would require some policy changes, and I'm afraid that is unlikely to happen. But expect some improvement in efficiencies, and that will also go a long way in supporting the economy.
Thank you so much, Dawie Roodt. And in that Bloomberg News article, they also point out that the trade between the two nations amounted to around $23.7 billion last year alone. Still